We've been talking about here over the last few weeks about angels. We've talked about fallen angels. And last week, of course, was our singing. But week before last, we kind of did a little introduction on demons. And we had some questions concerning these demons. And I noted that when we look out into the world and the concept that the world has concerning demons or that type of thinking is not the same thing in reality that we find within the context of Scripture. But it's nothing new. Even before the first century, before Jesus come into this world and died on the cross, there was this idea concerning demons. And we understand that there was most likely those demons in the world. Now, we don't find that talked about in the Old Testament. There are a few passages that reference what might be demons, but we find in the Scriptures predominantly demons talked about in the New Testament time, the time of Jesus. And it's for a purpose, it's for a reason, and we'll talk about that as we go along. In our world today, the more I look and the more I study and the more I see what's going on in the world today, demons and demonology is something that is not connected with what we find in the New Testament. It's found in the thinking of humanity, humans, and it is something that really had its beginning. Of course, we noted back in the 3rd century A.D., BC, before Christ, but really picked up in what they call the Renaissance era of our world. So it was also something that was very prominently placed into what we know of today as Catholicism. So the key factor in all of this is, what can demons do, really? And that's the question that we have to pose. So tonight, I want to talk about the nature and the characteristics of demons. Now, we understand when we think about the nature of demons, it is explicitly spelled out within the context of the New Testament. We understand that these demons are spiritual beings. Now, we gave a list last week that you can go back and look at on the video if you desire, talking about some of the ideas of where these demons come from. Well, I hold the idea, which I believe is very biblical, that these demons were some of the fallen angels that were being used for the purpose of God. Now, remember, all these angels were doing things for the purpose of God, even though some rebelled against God. Now, there was a purpose for these demons. And I, again, in the best of my knowledge, brings them back to the idea of them being those who had stood against God, rejected God. And they had the ability at the time to overtake an individual. But these beings were spiritual. Now, I want us to look at Matthew chapter 8, going down to verse 14. And I want you to notice what this says. It says, when Jesus came to Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. Now it's pointed out that Peter's mother-in-law was ill. Physical illness. She had a fever. We've all been physically ill. We've all had a fever. We understand illness. Verse 15. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she got up and waited on him. Now I want you to see what Jesus did. Now, most of the time, if we are sick and we have a fever, it takes a few days to get over the sickness and get back to doing what we think we need to be doing. Jesus' healing of this illness, a physical illness, nothing more, was instantaneous. It was completely gone. And Peter's mother-in-law gets up and started waiting on them. Now I know some of you ladies could be sick and just lying in the bed and the visitors come over and you think you got to get up and cook supper. I remember ladies doing that. They'd get up no matter how bad they felt. But no, this was an instantaneous, miraculous healing. Now let's look at verse 16. When evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed. And he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were ill. Now we have two things going on in this passage. Number one, there were individuals who were demon-possessed. Going back to these spiritual beings, talking right here in verse 16, he cast out the spirits with a word. And then there were the folks that were physically ill. We already seen the miraculous manifestation of Jesus in healing Peter's mother-in-law. So we go down here and we find these people who are demon-possessed. And I would concur that these individuals were possessed by these demons. These were an enmity within them. They were something maybe they didn't invite in, but they may have. We don't know that for sure. But what does it take for Jesus to cast them out? One word. A word. Illness, he just touched Peter's mother-in-law. Verse 17. This was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. He himself took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. Now, why could Jesus do this? To prove who he was and is. That's what the miraculous manifestations were all about. Whether it be a physical illness or this situation that we find in this demon possession. Now we noted here that these individuals were spiritual. Going back to verse 16, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits. That denotes the demons were spiritual. Now, when we think about this, we understand that spirit does not have flesh and bone. Now, in Luke chapter 24, now this is talking about Jesus's appearance before the people. And it talks about the differentiation between flesh and spirit. Jesus rose physically from the dead. Not just spiritually, but physically from the dead. So these individuals, these demons, are spirits, and Jesus explains the difference between it being a physical illness or a physical malady or a spiritual situation. In Luke 24, in verse 36, it says, "While they were telling these things, he stood in their midst. But they were startled and frightened and thought that they were seeing a spirit." They thought Jesus was a spirit. Verse 38, "And he said to them, 'Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that is, I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have.' And when he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet." Jesus was risen from the dead physically. Shows a differentiation between the spiritual and the physical, and there is. We all have a spirit. We all have the physical in this world. The physical stays here for us. Jesus ascended into heaven. But the spiritual is what goes on ahead whenever we leave this world. Now, these spiritual entities or demons, they could exercise both violation, I will return, and locomotion when he goes. Now let's look over in Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 44. It's talking about the unclean, the demon spirit, going in and out. They had that mobility, I guess we might say. It says in verse 43 of Matthew chapter 12, "Now when the unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places seeking rest and does not find it. And it says, I will return to my house from which I came, and when it comes, it finds it unoccupied, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and takes along with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there, and the last state of a man becomes worse than the first." This is the way it will be with this evil generation. And what he's talking about here is that if this spirit is cast out, it goes to these waterless places, doesn't find a place for it, so it comes back to that individual. The same is true with wickedness in our world. If it's cast out, it's just out there. It tries to find a home. When we are God's children, when we become God's children, we have our sins washed away. We cast evil aside in our lives. We have to what? Fill that void. And we fill it with righteousness. We fill it with Jesus. Or something worse will come along. And that's what he's talking about here in Matthew chapter 12. What we want to see is that these demons, they could be cast out. They can also come back. And there's a reality to all of this as we go along. Moreover, they could assimilate factual information. These demons that Jesus was dealing with, they weren't a bunch of dummies. They understood what's going on. In Luke chapter 4, beginning there in verse 31, these demons spoke to Jesus. They talked to him. Jesus knew who these demons were. This was not something that I don't know about you or you don't know about me. They knew one another. Luke chapter 4, beginning in verse 31. "And it came down to Capernaum, the city of Galilee, and he was teaching them on the Sabbath. and they were amazed at his teaching, for his message was with authority. In the synagogue, there was a man possessed by the spirit of an unclean demon, and he spoke out loud with a voice, "Let us alone. What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The demon within this person, he knew Jesus. Think about it. All the angels from their beginning, they all know Jesus because they've been in the heavenly abode. They've been there. They know him. He says, "Did you come here to do us harm, you Holy One of God?" Verse 35. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." And when the demon had thrown him down in the midst of the people, he came out of him without doing him any harm. What did it take for Jesus to cast this demon out? Told him to get out. Get out of this man. Well, now let's think about the setting. He was in Galilee. It was the Sabbath, and he was teaching all of these people. And I would concur that those people knew that this man had this unclean spirit, this spirit of the demon. And here Jesus, in front of all these people, two things. One, this demon calls him the Holy One of God. Secondly, he just casts him out. Verse 36, Luke chapter 4. And amazement came upon them all. And they began talking with one another, saying, "What is the message? For what authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and they come out." Folks, the message is, this is the Holy One of God. That's the message. And he has the power to deal with them. But what we're noting here is this demon understood who Jesus is. And he made it very clear to this group of people who Jesus is. They also possess a religious sensitivity. Let's turn to James chapter 2 and verse 17. James chapter 2, verse 17. Now James writes, "Even so faith, if it has works, is dead, being by itself." But someone will say, or someone may well say, "I have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works." Now he's talking about the differentiation between works and faith here. We got to have both. Can't have one or the other. But that's not our focus on this passage. Verse 19. You believe that God is one. Now James is saying, you that I'm writing to believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. Some of your versions uses the word tremble. These demons knew who Jesus is. They knew God. They knew deity. And they knew they'd messed up. The word shudder here, now I think this is interesting, means to bristle, stiffen, stand up. So the demons also believe, and they might bristle up a little bit, and we've noted that some of them did. Remember back in Luke 4, the demon said, Have you come to destroy me or destroy us? Well, that might be a little bristling up, but I think number 2 brings to light a more relative reality to these demons whenever they come in contact with Jesus. To shudder, to be struck with extreme fear, to be horrified. These demons, whenever they were in these people, when they possessed these individuals, they had a reprieve from how bad it was, where they were and to where they would return. And it's not going to be good in the very end whenever they're cast into the abyss with Satan. So, they possess a religious sensitivity. They understand where they were, their problems, and where they were headed. Well, the fact is they trembled in prospect of their ultimate doom. And that's what I was talking about. Matthew 8, starting in verse 28, says, "And he came to the other side into a country of the Gerasenes. 2 men who were demon-possessed met them as they were coming out of the tombs, and were so extremely violent that no one could pass by that way. And they cried out, 'What business do we have with each other, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?'" Now, we'll go back to this and talk a little bit more about it later. But these 2 individuals were demon-possessed. They were living in the tombs. They were so violent, people wouldn't even come around them. But Jesus come along, and they come out and say the same thing we just read a moment ago, back in Luke 4. What business do we have with each other, Son of God? Now, that brings us back to the idea of bristling or stiffening up. Well, they also say, "Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now that gets back to the idea of that shuddering, struck with extreme fear, because they knew where they was headed back to. They also realized their eternal destination. People today, they need to be shuddering with the lifestyle that they're living. But so many don't. As to their character, these demons, they are depicted as unclean. They are depicted as evil. In Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 43, it says, "Now when the unclean spirit goes out of a man," now we read this a moment ago, "it passes through waterless places seeking rest, and does not find it. Then it says, 'I will return to my house from which I came,' and when it comes, it finds it unoccupied, swept and put in order. Then it goes and takes along with it 7 other spirits, more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. And the last state of the man becomes worse than the first. That is the way it will also be with this evil generation." So going back, these spirits are unclean. They're wicked. They are evil. They go against God. And that's just the reality of it. These demons, these unclean spirits, are those who stand in opposition to God, even though they know God, even though they know their previous situation, even though they know their destiny. They are of a vile nature. Now, here, denoting the uncleanness, would have pricked the minds of those Jewish people. They would have understood that, because they always stood away from anything that's unclean. This passage reveals uncleanness, as we note here, as not clean, in the ceremonial sense, that which must be abstained from according to the Levitical law, and in a moral sense, unclean is in thought and life. In other words, this is something you want to stay away from. So let's look a little bit tonight at the effects of this demon possession. The physical and or mental effect occurring in a certain individual as a consequence of being possessed by demons. Now, we think about Mary Magdalene over in Luke chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. Now, if you've studied about Mary Magdalene, it's evident that she kind of had a rough life. But when she became a follower of Christ, she gave her all to Jesus. She had a rough life. And some even denote the idea that she may have been a prostitute. And that could coincide with pagan worship in the pagan temples. But, here's the thing. Might have been, that's about what we know about it. What we do know is that she had a problem with demons possessing her. Luke chapter 8, verse 1. Soon afterwards, he began going around from one city and village to another, proclaiming and preaching the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him. And also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and sickness. Mary, who was called Magdalene, one from whom 7 demons had gone out. She wasn't the only one they healed of the evil spirits and sickness. And I want you to get that differentiation between demon possession and physical sickness, just everyday physical sickness. Sometimes it does look like physical sickness. Demon possession looked like physical sickness. Anyway, continuing here, and Joanne, the wife of Cuz, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who were contributing to their support out of their private means. So Mary Magdalene had 8 of these demons. Some demoniacs were afflicted with blindness and had the inability to speak. Well, Matthew 9, verse 32, it notes that as they were going out, a mute, demon-possessed man was brought to him. After the demon was cast out, the mute man spoke, and the crowds were amazed and were saying, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." Well, this man was mute, couldn't speak. The reason he couldn't speak was because of the demon. Now, can there be physical maladies that would keep one from speaking? Yes, there is. But this is what was happening through this demon possession. Some thus possessed might be prone to violence. Well, let's go back one more before I get to that one. Is in Matthew 12:22. Then a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute was brought to Jesus, and he healed him, so that the mute man spoke and saw. All the crowds were amazed and were saying, "This man cannot be the son of David, can he?" All these things are very public. All these, what we call today exorcisms, they're all public. Everybody sees what's going on. There's a purpose because of that. the prone of violence, Matthew 17, verse 14. When they came to the crowd, the man came up to Jesus, falling on his knees before him, saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is a lunatic, and is very ill. For he often falls into the fire and often into the water. Now, we'll go back to this word lunatic. Some of them translate that epileptic. And that is a translation that is plausible. But even though one acts like an epileptic under demon possession and does what we're reading here, doesn't mean he had epilepsy. Am I getting that across? I hope. Anyway, verse 16. I brought him to your disciples. They could not cure him. And Jesus answered and said, you unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him here. And Jesus rebuked him, and the demon came out of him, and the boy was cured in about 4 days. Does that say 4 days? At once. Instantaneous. Mark 9, verse 17. And one of the crowd answered him, Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed with the spirit which makes him mute. And when it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and stiffens out. And I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it. Well, these things you would think would be an epileptic seizure. These happen with epilepsy. They do. Well, epilepsy, lunacy. The problem was demon possession. Luke 9, verse 38. And the man from the crowd shouted, saying, Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is only a boy. And the spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams and is thrown into a convulsion with foaming at the mouth, and only with difficulty does it leave him, mauling him as it leaves. These are all parallel verses of the same occurrence. So he acts like a lunatic. Look at 2a. Epilepsy being supposed to return and increase with the increase of the moon. This meaning is doubtful, as the Greeks knew nothing of epilepsy. So most likely it just boiled down to demon possession. And that's pretty much what we need to denote. A demon-possessed man has also excessive strength. Let's look over at Luke chapter 8, verse 26. Then they sailed to the country of the Gerasenes. We read this a while ago. Which is opposite Galilee. And when he came out into the land, he was met by a man from the city who was possessed with demons, and who had not put on any clothes for a long time, and was not living in a house, but in the tombs. Okay, this fella, back in the tombs, and he is having a clothing problem. Verse 28. Seeing Jesus, he cried out and fell before him with a loud voice. Now listen to this. What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I beg you, do not torment me. Shuddering here. Verse 29. For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man, for it had seized him many times, and he was bound with chains and shackles, and kept under guard, and yet he would break his bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. Now that's some strength. I broke a lot of chains in my day, but it was usually between two pieces of equipment. I didn't just pick them up and pop them, I promise you. This demon was strong, had great control over this individual. And Jesus asked this verse 30, and Jesus asked him, what is your name? And he said, Legion, for many demons had entered him. So there was more than one, there was a lot. And they were strong. Well, characterized by both emotional illness and antisocial behavior, but when Christ purged the demons, This poor fellow seemed to clean up his act. Verse 35, Luke chapter 8. The people came out to see what had happened. And they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone out sitting down at the feet of Jesus, clothed in his right mind, and they were frightened. Dear friends, it is important that we understand, instantaneous, this man, demons gone, legion, he was in his right mind. It's important to distinguish between the case and effect in these occurrences. The demon possession was that which emulated physical illness, yes. But it was because of the demon. It was not because of the physical problems of whatever illness that might have come along. We go back here to Mark 1. We'd already read this. Simon's mother-in-law, Jesus healed her. He healed other people, and he cast out demons. So we have two different things, and we need to kind of keep that in perspective as we go along with our study. So next Wednesday evening, I want us to talk a little bit about the divine purpose of demon possession, because we understand that it was real and that it happened, and there was a divine purpose for such things. So we'll start there next Wednesday evening.